Welcome back to another episode of Talking Hymns with Shane and Tim. This week we are talking about a hymn that you and I, Tim, were just talking about this. It's a well-known tune. It's about the most well-known hymn author you can think of. And yet itself as a hymn is not necessarily a well-known hymn. And so the hymn we are talking about this week is Jesus Shall Reign Where'er the Sun. All right, so Jesus Shall Reign Where'er the Sun, written by Isaac Watts. So that's about as big as you get. He's one of the most well-known hymn writers in the world. Do you have a personal relationship with Isaac Watts that you'd like to tell us about here?
No, he sort of escaped the Lutheran radar, but he was particularly fond of setting poems to the Psalms. All of his hymns somehow point back to the Psalms, which, oddly enough, this one does too, even though it talks about Jesus.
Yes, that's true. That's true. And that's one of the things that in my reading about Watts, because there's not a lot about this hymn specific, it's more about Watts, is one of the things I had learned was that he was considered very revolutionary in his day because the pattern for writing hymns was that you would either stick within the established language of hymns or very near to the language of Scripture. But Watts didn't do that, right?
Right. He decided Psalms needed some Christianizing, that Christ needed to be mentioned in the Psalms, not just the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's now Christ. And it's an admirable task that he set about to do.
Yeah, one of the historians said this. They said Scripture for Watts was viewed as a launching point for his hymns, but he interspersed his own thoughts and experiences with hymns. And what struck me as interesting about that is within modern songwriting, we would just say, yeah, that's songwriting. but for that era, that was considered a little bit radical. I didn't really find information if he would receive criticism about that or blowback, but
yet another example of an Englishman who turned preacher.
Correct.
Yet another one.
Yep.
And yet another, in this particular case, matter of an English text being set to an English tune. But yeah, he evidently was somehow involved in England with the Church of Dissent, which I had not heard of before.
Yeah, I had a little trouble placing exactly where he was because he's at a period of time where certainly the Church of England would have been forming and it would have been really important to the nationalistic things, which we'll get to that in a little bit.
Yeah.
But the church he was at forever. I mean, I believe that he began ministry in 1702, and then he took the position at Sir Thomas Abney in 1712 and remained there for the rest of his life. And so he has a remarkably stable, and that's really sort of what we identify as his prime hymn writing time, although he did write his first hymn when he was 20. Mm-hmm. Back a little bit to the issue about sticking to the text or taking liberties with the text. The way I take it is we've probably all heard the maxim, following the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law, or following the spirit of the law versus the letter of the law. I tend to think of, I think his hymn writing in that sense, that he is following the intent of the text or how one would reasonably interpret it without necessarily following the explicit wording of the text. The closest comparison I would make is there's a very popular translation of the Bible called The Message, done by Eugene Peterson, which is a paraphrase version of the text, which attempts to communicate the spirit of the text, although not a literal word-for-word translation. And I think that's one way I think one could help understand what he's doing here, because one could get a little paranoid and quickly jump into, he's just making things up. But as with all things, as we are learning, everything is subject to criticism. And this hymn, and let's bridge into this a little bit, this is a hymn that has had some verses removed from it, second, third, and seventh verses. Did you read anything about that? What was going on with some of the language there?
Well, evidently when it reflected back to the original psalm, there is mention in that passage in the Psalms about the kingdoms of Sheba and Seba.
Mm-hmm. Correct, yes.
So I believe I read that he wanted to make it more relevant to England at that time and changed it to Syria and Persia in whatever verse it is that we no longer sing, which is fine with me. It doesn't seem particularly relevant.
Yeah, some more modern hymn criticism. One I thought was particularly interesting is the criticism of this hymn is that Watts made David, the psalmist, sound like the King of England and Scotland in the way he spoke.
England forever.
And thus made David sound like an orthodox and patriotic 18th century Christian.
Okay, isn't that kind of cool when you think
Yeah.
of that whole English pride?
Yeah.
It seeps into something that should be humble. But
Certainly, and it relates to the big subject. This isn't a podcast. This isn't a show about imperialism, but that's certainly something that we in the Western culture have been grappling with ever since, the seeds to World War I. And so you can see its corrosive effects on the continent of Africa, to armed conflict, to things we're still dealing with today, imperialistic culture that we're still trying to unwind, and that is. One of the battlegrounds you wouldn't expect for that is hymnals, which is why there are some versions of hymnals that just don't even like the word king. Despite king having a strong biblical root, it's hard for some modern hearers that have been victims of imperialism to not have negative associations with that word. And that's a challenging thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk about the tune, Duke Street. I know you said it's one of your favorites.
It's something I grew up with as a Lutheran, but to a different text. It was "I Know That My Redeemer Lives" at that point. It's a great framework for a tune. There's not a whole lot of intricate melody. It's all sort of predictable, again, like last week. But the overall effect is that it leaves you a whole bunch of, shall we say, leeway if you're going to make an arrangement of it, because you can use that as a guideline. The melody itself, it works as a hymn. It gets you to the point. And, he's in our hymn book. His texts are in our hymn book 14 times. Among his other hits, Joy to the World,
Yeah.
When I Survey the Wondrous Cross, From All That Dwell Below the Skies. I mean, the guy was a hit machine. He was, his texts have endured.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
But the melody, I don't know much about the melody other than it was paired with that text something like 80 years later.
Okay.
So, I mean, the name Duke Street is supposedly the only connection that hymnologists can find is that it may have been Hatton's address. That Hatton wrote
Okay,
the
yeah,
music
and so we're talking about John Hatton, the author of Duke Street. Yeah,
the composer of Duke.
yeah, the composer of that, and because the first instance of Watts's text appeared in his publication Psalms of David Imitated in 1719, but it wasn't paired probably closer, as you said, till 1800.
Almost 1800.
Yeah, and it actually it's in the 1800s when some of those verses start being removed. And so it's interesting. It's Watts's text, particularly those second, third, and seventh verses, didn't really have a long life cycle to them.
Yeah, isn't that interesting?
So let's talk themes a little bit. Obviously, this is about God's authority, Christ's reign, and because of that, it makes it appropriate for any time of year. But the day I think of particularly with this, and granted, there's no shortage of hymns that deal with this, is Christ the King Sunday. We're getting closer to the end of the liturgical calendar, which will come not the last Sunday in November, but the second to last Sunday in November is that last Sunday of the liturgical year, which we call Christ the King Sunday. And so I think, if we were here in the sanctuary with access to all that we have access to, this is the type of hymn that you would you'd process to, or that, it would be a prelude, but it wouldn't be a soft prelude. It'd be a big bombastic prelude. And so that those themes are there. And to talk specifically about his relationship to the text, this one could probably draw from various sources, but it's probably closest in line with Psalm 72. So I wanted to highlight a couple verses here, and I think it illustrates how Watts took the spirit of the text and launched off of it.
Good.
So verse 1 is, Jesus shall reign where'er the sun does its successive journey run. His kingdom shall stretch from shore to shore till moons shall wax and wane no more. Now, its closest comp would be Psalm 72, verse 5, and the words to that go, may he live while the sun endures, and as long as the moon throughout all generations. So that one's fairly close.
Right.
When
a lot more poetic. But
Yes. And then you get into where he takes a little more liberty, but again, I think we would say the theme, the spirit of the text is correct, is in verse 4, where he says, "Blessings abound where'er he reigns, the prisoners leap to loose their chains, the weary find eternal rest, and all who suffer want are blessed." So that lines up with Psalm 72, verses 12 through 14. "For he delivers the needy when they call, the poor and those who have no helper. He has pity on the weak and the needy and saves the lives of the needy. From oppression and violence he redeems their life, and precious is their blood in his sight." And so it's a good spiritual successor to that.
Well, and as you're reading it, it sort of occurs to me, he really is just driving the whole Godhead again together. Whereas it was God in the Psalms, it's now Christ.
Correct. Yeah.
Which is one and the same.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
it's we've learned some stuff about these hymns as we've gone through them.
We have, that's for sure.
I've
That's
taken them for granted.
Well, here it is. Here is Christ shall reign wherever the sun. So this week was a little bit different, and we began with a prelude version of that, and for the sake of this episode, it functioned as a prelude. It's of this hymn, but we're going to do a different one, and it's a story of contrast. Talk about that a little bit.
If we were meeting and we were having a meeting place for Sundays, I would probably have chosen the first one as a prelude, though. Even though you say if it was Christ the King Sunday, I could use the second one. What I've done is chosen two radically different settings of that melody. The first one uses the melodic comfort of those intervals. It's by Wilbur Held. It's very peaceful. He creates a little melody that he extracted from the melody of the hymn. It's just enough there that you say, "Oh, that sounds da 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 da." His motif is the first four notes, but then he makes a really nice use of it, and then weaves the melody in and out. 4 measures of melody, 4 measures of the filler, 4 measures of melody, 4 measures of the filler. It alternates. The second one I chose has. It's actually the same tempo, but it sounds hideously faster because there's so much going on in the hands.
Yes, I've heard it. There's a lot going on this one.
And it sort of makes me crazy. But as I told you, I am determined to do it just because I wanted to show the way a hymn can be transformed.
Absolutely.
By a good arranger.
Yeah, and to go back to what you said earlier, the sort of simplistic nature of the melody lends itself to a wide variety of interpretations.
Right.
Yeah.
And for all the contrast, it just shows again. That's why I'm so sold on hymn arrangements. It gives people something to grab onto. It's like, I know that melody, but it's so nice to see how the arranger-composer conceives of it.
Yeah, and it definitely provokes an emotional response in different ways because it'll evoke something, but at some point it reveals the melody or places a little more up front. And given if it's resolved to the prime. Everything's major and big and an agreement, it can provoke that really strong, make you want to stand up response.
Right. And the second one that I'm doing is actually called a toccata on Duke Street. And toccata is always sort of synonymous with showy.
Yeah.
A lot of stuff going on.
Yes,
melody in the pedals.
The famous toccata and fugue.
Right.
Yes.
It's Italian for to touch. Toccata.
And does that lend itself to more staccato elements in it? Is that I've always associated that in my mind.
Not necessarily. Yeah. It does tend to lend itself to a lot of fancy finger work. Technologically, a lot of dexterity.
Okay.
Fast stuff. Usually, a toccata is pretty showy.
Yeah.
And this one is, and as I've said, This is not a this is not a real performance. This is just something we're doing for the sake of contrasting. I can almost promise there will be errors in the second setting, but hey, I'm all for it.
It is what it is. We're happy
It
to hear
is.
it. You're going to put on a show for us.
I will put on some kind of show, yeah.
And I'll make sure to try to digitally put some smoke in between when the fingers go fast, so it accentuates the speed.
Well, you have to remember, make the smoke somehow go by the pages too, because for me, page turning is also a big challenge in this particular one.
Well, here it is. Thanks, Tim.